Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here today. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor of Lincoln Square. And joining me today is Donald Moynihan. He's a professor at the University of Michigan's Ford School and the co-director of the Better Government Lab, where he researches how to reduce bureaucratic burdens to public services. And his research has been cited in both President Biden's and President Obama's budget proposals, as well as in media like the New York Times and the Atlantic. And finally, he writes the Can We Still Govern Substack, which you should definitely subscribe to. So thanks for being here, Don.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Susan.
Great. Well, today I wanted to talk about the sweeping changes to government that we've seen under a second Trump administration, including the DOGE cuts, the direct file fiasco, and more. So let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of the administrative changes and government cuts under Trump this year. First of all, is there any good to talk about?
No, not that I can see. And this it's a weird thing to say because usually you can both sides almost everything. And initially when Doge was announced, I think there was some well of goodwill where people were saying, well, maybe I don't agree with Elon Musk or Donald Trump, but these guys seem to know what they're doing. They've built companies. And so there was this hope that we would see a version of Doge that was focused on building stuff and making stuff better. And maybe that was incredibly naive. Um, I wrote something right before the administration started suggesting that Doge was probably going to be more about an oligarchy grabbing power. And it's turned out to be more like that pessimistic version than the optimistic version. And so, as best as I can tell, Doge has done nothing to improve the quality of government. It hasn't built anything that would improve public services. It has certainly cut stuff and it has cut spending, but normally, when we think about efficiency, like the formal sort of definition of efficiency is that it's a ratio between inputs and outputs.
Hmm.
And so, if you're not thinking about the outputs, which Doge is not, then it's very hard to say it's made things more efficient. And in fact, some of the things we've discovered from watching closely is that Doge will probably cost the government money in the long run. It'll probably increase deficits in the long run because some of the cuts they're making will actually reduce revenue to government. And so just focusing on the effects of cuts in the IRS, that will have this really dramatic effect on revenue coming in for the next 10 years that could potentially be in the trillions.
And they did get rid of the direct file system that his administration pioneered. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that you've written about that as, one of those key examples of uh, Doge cutting and making things far worse.
Yeah, and the sort of background on direct file is the US is a little unusual among richer countries in that it's difficult for taxpayers to report their taxes every year. Usually we have to go to an accountant or an online software and then we pay them a certain amount of money. Most other countries that are as wealthy as the US, you do that for free. The government sets
Mm.
up a website. They'll usually give you your tax information, you check it, you click a button, so you save a bunch of time and a bunch of money. Since at least the George W. Bush administration, there has been an ambition that the federal government would do this. And for about 20 years, they've had something called a free file tax program, which most of you will never have heard of. And that's because the the product exists, you can technically use it, but it's a very low quality product. And it's a
Mm.
partnership between the private tax preparation industry and the IRS. And the private tax preparation industry has no incentive to make this a good product, and so it's a pretty crummy product. Um, Direct file was something that started during the pandemic, where the federal government asked IRS to investigate building a tool that would allow Americans to pay their taxes. For the last two tax seasons, they've allowed this tool to be piloted online in different states. It's a complicated product. Like when you're thinking about digital products, a tax product that could be used by all Americans
Hmm.
is a hugely challenging task to build. There's some real constraints because of the complexity of our tax system. Um, but the bottom line was over the last 2 years, they built this product, rolled it out slowly. Most people who used it loved it. It had like this very positive customer experience scores. And so this was sort of an example of, gee, government can actually build cool digital products. It can build products that make it easier for you to interact with government. People almost have like warm and fuzzy feelings about the IRS, which is, that's sort of unusual.
Right.
Um, and the customer feedback that IRS got when it collected data every year has been fantastic.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was an example of, gee, this should be exactly the type of thing DOGE should be doing, building cool digital products that make life easier for the public.
Hmm.
But the opposite happened. DOGE killed the product. It told sometime in March the software developers to stop working on the product. Many of those people no longer work in government, and I've talked to a bunch of them. These were exactly the type of people you want to see in government. They were very public service motivated. They cared about like doing an amazing job for the public. They had could easily have earned more money in the private sector, but they were passionate about this mission. And now they're gone from government. So it's not just, we as a community lost this opportunity for a cool product. We also lost a bunch of people who were very talented and cared about public service. And that's a little bit of the story writ large for DOGE. They haven't built anything, but they have pushed out a lot of very talented public servants.
Hmm. And, for years, Republicans in particular have talked about the need to make it more efficient to file your taxes. I remember Paul Ryan saying that it should fit on the back of a postcard. And so, this seemed to be a step in that direction that you think would have some bipartisan support. And basically, the program seemed to be about making it a little easier, a little less awful to do your taxes and not have to fork over a lot of money to TurboTax or one of those private companies or, an accountant if things were complicated. But there was extensive lobbying from companies like TurboTax to kill this, wasn't there?
Yeah, millions of dollars spent by Intuit, the parent company of TurboTax, and others in the private tax preparation industry. And they've long viewed this as a source of potential competition to them. And there are some philosophical differences here. I think the people working on direct file took the position that the government is forcing you to pay taxes already. It shouldn't also force you to complete a time tax where you spend a bunch of money or a bunch of additional time dealing with really complicated tax reporting processes. We should make it as easy as possible. We should take out some of the administrative pain of interacting with the tax system. Whereas that's where the private tax preparation industry makes its money, is in sort of selling solutions to that problem. One important thing to know is that there was never a case where direct file would serve every taxpayer.
Right.
Like it really only worked for people with lower income and simpler tax situations who are going to take the standard deduction.
Hmm.
And it worked pretty well for them, but it's not going to work for higher income earners. So it was never going to grab the entire market, but the existence of a public option by itself was seen as a threat to the tax preparation industry.
Hmm.
And I think that's part of why such an impressive product was killed.
And let's talk a little more about Elon Musk's baby Doge and what they've been doing. So it sounds to me like you're not convinced that Elon really knows anything about government, that he's just moving fast and breaking things. But the bottom line is, why is he doing this, and who is benefiting from this?
Yeah, it's an incredibly important question. because Doge has no real parallel in American history. So,
Hmm.
I study government. There have been lots of different types of government commissions over the years. There was reinventing government under President Clinton. President Reagan had the Grace Commission. Sometimes presidents pass civil service legislation, as President Carter did. But there's nothing that's remotely like Doge in terms of its immediate impact and scale in government. There's nothing like Doge in terms of its conflicts of interest. And
Hmm.
so I think the most important fact to know about Musk is there's been no actor in the federal government who is as conflicted as Musk is. He, runs very important companies that are either regulated by or are a contractor for the federal government.
Right. Starlink, prime example with government contracts.
Yep.
Tesla has gotten quite a bit of help from the government.
Yeah, and he's benefited from the government. He's also provided services to the government. Some of, his technologies, he works at the cutting edge, and so
Hmm.
he's always going to be interacting with regulators who tell him just how far he can go and when, you're violating the rules. And so two striking facts that we knew about Musk before he came into government. One was he had all of these conflicts, and you were handing over authority to potentially fire the regulators of your businesses to this guy. And the second is he really believes in conspiracy theories. Like if you look at his social media feed, um, some years ago, it sort of tilted towards this sort of very right wing conspiracy worldview. Um, which includes a lot of the Trumpian conspiracies about government, that,
Hmm.
government is sort of deep state, they're out to get you. And I think that is important because that helps us to understand what he's been doing in government, which is that he doesn't see much of what government does as having a value. And so if you cut
Hmm.
something, you're not really losing anything of value. He
Hmm.
sees most governments workers as providing nothing of value. And so again, if they're fired, it doesn't make a difference. And he sees many of them as involved in conspiracies. And so there was no real sign that USAID was top of the chopping block. Like that was a surprise, I think, to pretty much everyone. And I've seen no good explanation for why USAID was decimated immediately under Musk
Hmm.
beyond the fact that there's right wing online chatter that accuses USAID of being part of the deep state and being
Hmm.
involved in these various conspiracies, which Musk appeared to believe in. And the gap then between the reality where potentially millions of people, of the most vulnerable people in the world, could die because the aid that USAID provided will no longer be there. And Musk's worldview, which is that, they were inherently corrupt and doing bad stuff, couldn't be further from one another.
Right. And, for decades, we've heard the mantra from Republicans the government is broken. And I mean, it seems that most people believe that to some extent. And it also seemed to help Trump win in both 2016 and 2024 from people who were fed up with things and thought that he could, bring some sort of change, bring his business acumen to the government. Um, and so, when you have a lot of people who think that government is inefficient and it doesn't work for me, um, you know, it's a fair viewpoint, but it seems like what Musk and Trump are doing are not really accomplishing ways to make it better or more efficient. But if we were to put you in charge, what are some of the things that you would do so that people do feel like government is more responsive? If that was the perspective you went in for, like sort of a benign, not haphazard cutting Doge.
Yeah, I think that a couple of things can be true at once. One is that for decades, both parties have been telling the public, Washington is broken, especially presidential candidates. I'm going to
Right.
come as an outsider and I'm going to fix it. And pretty much both presidential sets of candidates have been saying that since the 1970s. Um, it's also the case, and so there hasn't been a lot of pushback against that, right? It's also the case that government isn't inherently efficient, and because it doesn't work in private marketplaces, it doesn't have competitive pressures to improve. And so you need to think about what are alternative ways to make government work better. And we can talk about a couple of those. Um, and finally, then that the solutions that DOGE, and I think more broadly the Trump administration, are bringing to the table with government are not going to make government more efficient. I was in DC last night. I was talking to some people who were in the federal government, and they said nothing is getting done. Like,
Mm.
this is the most efficient time period they've ever experienced. People don't know what's happening. There's no strategic direction. You don't know if the person you're working with is going to be there next week. People are
Yeah.
being forced back to offices where they don't have space. Like, there's nothing here that's driven by a genuine desire to make government work better. If I was put in charge, I think one thing there's a couple of things I would focus on. One is improving personnel issues. And
Hmm.
so Congress has now passed civil service legislation since 1978. It's well past time for them to do something. And I think the fact that they haven't passed any legislation has been sort of an invitation for Trump to fill the void and say,
Hmm.
I'm going to claim this authority in ways that are going to be very damaging. Like, he is politicizing as well as downsizing the public sector. See, top of the list is hiring people, making public service attractive to young and talented people. The average age of the federal workforce is older than the private sector. And especially now, it's just going to be hard to persuade people to come work for the federal government. And so I think making it easier for people to get in the door, get in more quickly. They don't necessarily have to spend a lifetime in the public sector, but come in for like 3-year terms or 5-year terms. That's how we got a lot of good tech workers in
Mm.
since about 2014, is sort of short-term fellowships, and then some of those folks stayed.
Mm.
Um, the other thing I would do is invest in sort of centers of innovation within government. And so one thing that was true after the Affordable Care Act website disaster, which everyone
Mhm.
agreed was a disaster, including President Obama, is they started to hire technologists in government and give them some room to solve problems. And that
Mhm.
that was the creation of the US Digital Service, 18F, like in-house consultants. Um, and I think there is a tendency to always assume that contracting out will find you the best people and the smartest people. And having studied this for a long time, I think there are going to be cases where contracting out and privatization absolutely makes sense. But for core tasks and core products, you have to have internal capacity. And so I would hire very talented people and give them the type of license and support that Musk has getting from Trump,
Mhm.
not to break stuff, but to fix stuff.
Mhm.
And that was, I think, one of the tragedies of direct file, which we talked about earlier, is that that was one of only a very few number of products that people were given license to build, that was visible, that the public could really see, that could make a difference. There should have been a lot more of that, and there should have been, basically a Ministry of Digital Transformation that was focused on making this stuff work better. So that's
Mhm.
how more and more of our interactions with government are occurring through a digital space now. That's where I would focus our attention.
And the other side of these sweeping changes that the Trump administration is bringing is really a politicization, apologies, of so many functions in government that is new, and it may not be things that people necessarily think about, like the National Weather Service, for instance, where we all rely on if there's a tornado or a hurricane in the area. But I mean, obviously the key example would be the Department of Justice and going after Trump's enemies. But we've really seen science being politicized. And I know that that's something that you've written about, and that has huge implications for public health and research.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Department of Justice, where we might see like someone going after President Trump's political enemies, and that sounds bad, but we sort of think, okay, well that's not going to affect us.
Right.
But something like science is going to affect us. Maybe not tomorrow, but the next time major health event occurs, or in the long run, when you think about the fact that the NIH basically generates 99% of new medical innovations through its funding. Like if you cut that by 40% or 50% that's been proposed in the president's budget, then you're just looking at less innovation, less economic innovation, less healthcare innovation, less quality of life improvements. There are other ways in a more immediate fashion that some of this politicization is going to matter where um, take Social Security, for example, DOGE and Trump kept talking about fraud,
Hmm.
and Social Security started doing these additional checks for fraud when people made a phone call to Social Security. And they found, I think, two cases of probable fraud out of about 110,000. So
Hmm.
that's a 0.0018 percentage point, right? Like it's an incredibly tiny fraction.
Right.
But the cost of doing that is that it increased wait times for people trying to get their
Hmm.
retirement claims processed by 25%. And so everyone was dealing with as much higher administrative burden in the search
Hmm.
for fraud. And one of the things that struck me in looking at this case is that the Washington Post interviewed people at Social Security, and they said, "We knew there was no fraud, but
Hmm.
we were afraid we would get fired if we brought that up."
Hmm.
Right? And so that sense of political fear where you're afraid to provide uncongenial but factual information to your political boss means that they will respond more with their like gut hunches about why government is wrong or their conspiracy theory. And so it's not really a rational way to run an organization. Um, and so one, final plug about politicization here is that President Trump wants to expand the number of political appointees. We currently have about
Hmm.
4,000, which is a lot, and wants to expand that to about 50,000 by turning career civil servants into political appointees so
Hmm.
he could fire them more easily, which is just going to worsen that situation I talked about. And people have until Friday, if you want to make a public comment to the government about this, you have until Friday to do so, where you can say, this does not reflect what I think is good government, or I think this is going to be bad. Um, you've shared what I've written about that, and if people look at that post, there are links there to where you can directly make a comment about this proposed policy.
Right. It's so easy to feel helpless when we look at all of these, really detrimental changes going on in the government. But this is something that you can do now. You don't have to wait to vote until 2026. If you go back and we did repost Don's post from his own Substack, where he just goes through step by step what you can do to make your voice heard for some of these really damaging changes to the civil service. And we've already heard back from dozens of our readers who, already did that. And the more that we can provide these sort of avenues for you to get involved, the better, because they count in the fact that people aren't going to be paying attention, that it's just too
Uh,
difficult. But it's actually something that probably takes less than 5 minutes.
Yep, you can write two sentences. And the thing is, you might be writing on this site and you think this isn't going to make any difference. No one is going to read this. By law, they have to read all of those comments. They have to summarize the comments. They have to respond to the comments. They have to explain what, was the relative balance of comments supporting or opposing a policy. So by law, they are constrained where they cannot ignore you. They might still come to a different decision, but they have to
Mhm.
explain why. And then if someone sues about the policy, they will
Mhm.
go back and they will look at this comment process. And if they feel like the comments were not or the final decision was not responsive to comments appropriately, they can throw out the policy. And
Mhm.
so it really is a huge deal that a lot of citizens don't know about, like
Mhm.
the comment process for rules. It is, in my mind, just as an effective a way of getting to policymakers as calling your senator or your member of Congress. So I would encourage people to give it a go. And it's, it's a, if you've never done it before, it's a civic action you can take, and you can say, I've done that, and now that is forever in the public record, and they have to
Mhm.
pay attention to it.
Right. While we still have these tools, let's take advantage of it, because, right now we can still get up and march. They're not doing mass arrests at protests. They're still, following these guidelines, for public comments on all sorts of issues. And so, there are many ways that we can stand up and refuse and resist. And, just as we feel beaten down, seeing everybody turn on all of these ideas does make an impact. Certainly we've seen that the Supreme Court seems to be paying attention with issues like birthright citizenship. The Trump administration is not getting a total pass right now. So, it's disheartening sometimes when we see weakened institutions, but that can be part of where we all come in. Um, and I wanted to go back just a little bit on the scientific research front. We've seen a lot of grants being frozen or canceled to universities, and of course, Trump has gone to war with Harvard in particular. But for a massive research university like the University of Michigan, where you're at, I think a lot of people don't know how much government funding plays into some of the really innovative technologies and private businesses that end up coming out of these incubators. And so we're talking about, in terms of scientific research in healthcare, a real impact on people's lives, but also there's a huge economic cost as well. And so, if we start seeing these programs just shut down for good, what is that going to mean in terms of um, us continuing to compete with nations like China internationally? And what's that going to mean for innovation in our country? How would you even restart all of that? Even if Trump were defeated in 3 years?
Yeah, there's so many ways in which we could think about the issue of science, but yeah, I'll start with the local one. Like, so I live in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. At one point, I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, at UW-Madison, and these sort of land grant universities, especially the Midwest and the South, were built by governments partly to, give access to world-class education to people who weren't living on the East Coast. And so there are this historic public achievement that is exceptional. And the U.S. Education system is the best in the world. If you think about it as an exporter, it exports tens of millions of goods because we have lots of foreign students who come to the U.S. who subsidize local students by paying our very high tuition rates, but they help to make higher education affordable. They bring money, they bring resources, and then you also have the sort of network effect where around your university, you're going to see more innovators, more economic opportunity, partly because you built your own little Silicon Valley in Michigan or Florida or Georgia. So if you're in the South or the Midwest, many red states, it's crazy that you would be allowing the federal government to shoot one of the main sources of economic innovation in your state. From a national perspective, there was a really great piece in the New York Times yesterday, an opinion piece that basically compared China and the US and said, we might look back at the first months of the Trump administration and say that was the precise moment where the American century ended
Yes.
and China took control. Because we are doing now the sorts of things that was happening in China during the Cultural Revolution, right? There's a culture war being waged on the higher education elites at the time where China is finally catching up with us in some of these areas of investment. And so we're taking our foot off the gas, driving the car into the ditch as China is going full speed ahead. And so, just from sort of industrial policy perspective, um, there is really no pure competitor when it comes to science except potentially for China. And if the US keeps doing what it has been doing in the past, I don't think that would be as great a threat. But
Hmm.
the fact that we're sort of opening the door, I think, is going to have this negative long-term effect on America's ability to compete. It's sort of as if there's a Sputnik moment and the president is telling the public, we should not compete with Russia. We should just,
Yeah.
that's a waste of money. Let's just do our own things. All of these universities are too woke, so let's not pay attention to that.
Right. Trump has always talked really tough on China. He's gotten a lot of bluster about it, but I mean, certainly when his top advisor Elon has, massive investments in China and has made many concessions to the Chinese government so that he can continue to expand his empire there. And so, you know, eh, eh, with Trump tying our hands behind our backs economically with so many of his policies, from tariffs to cutting research, I mean, what's what is his real goal with China? Is there one, or does he just d- it- it- I guess what I'm asking is he aware of how he is destroying the dollar and our research in the government?
Mhm.
Because it certainly seems that people like Elon do, and they're fine with it.
Yeah, and I think Elon Musk is one of a number of people who is so wealthy, and his businesses are embedded around the world that his interests are not necessarily aligned with the interests of America, right?
Hmm.
He's like there's a clear conflict between his engagements with China and his engagements with the United States.
Hmm.
Um, I think with Trump, it's a little bit different. I think he has a theory of American greatness, which
Hmm.
is this sort of rose-tinted view of the 1960s or the 1950s, where everyone's working in factories, and that we can rewind time back to that moment.
Mm.
And I think, that's wrong for a number of reasons. I think, partly you were not going to see a massive rebuilding of the manufacturing base. I don't think you can build walls around just one country and assume that the rest of the global market will stop and accommodate that country. So I think it's wrong on that count. And I think it's also wrong on the other things that made America great. And so we mentioned science, higher education. After World War II, the US basically, if you've never read the report by Vannevar Bush at the end of World War II, where he basically said, here's what America needs to do, become the world dominant power, is just invest intensely in science, build research partnerships with universities. It
Hmm.
shouldn't be government run science because that's not going to work.
Hmm.
But build this research infrastructure and invest heavily in that, and that will pay dividends. And that worked. That completely worked.
Hmm.
Joseph Nye, who passed away, professor at Harvard relatively recently, wrote about soft power.
Right.
And that was the other way America sort of built its global influence, is less about having armies invade other
Hmm.
countries. It was more about sharing our ideas and our ideals, partly through tools like USAID.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so withdrawing those sorts of investments and thinking we'll solve our problems militarily and with tariffs, to me seems like just sort of a misreading both of the history and of the present moment that we're living in.
Right. Um, I think the last thing that I'm curious to talk to you about is, you know, w- do things like the Newark airport shutdowns expose how much we've taken for granted, perhaps, that did work in government? Because, up until this year, I think unless you had a real fear of flying, you felt fairly secure that your airplane was not going to fall out of the sky if you were going to visit your relatives across the country. Um, and also, do you think that, pretty soon we're going to start seeing some real tragedies from these cuts, like, not getting those emergency weather alerts where we're entering hurricane season right now. Does it take something like that to really break through to people? Especially when so many of us have, I think, gotten used to this idea like, oh, everything is terrible. So, it's just one more thing. At one point, do a majority of us decide, wait, things maybe weren't perfect, but they weren't like this. And the X factor is Trump.
Yeah, we don't pay attention to stuff when it's working well. That's sort of human nature, especially the government. And I'm saying this as someone who's going to get on a plane later on this evening, and so we'll be thinking about Newark. And I think it's all of those individual cases, the causes might be different, but it's always worth then asking the bigger questions. Like, how are the policies of this government either contributing to or solving the problems that we're facing, right? And I think in the case of Newark, it raises the question of like, how is downsizing, disinvestment, making the federal government a toxic workplace for employees actually going to solve these meat and potatoes problems? Almost all federal agencies exist because enough members of Congress decided this was a good investment of tax dollar funds, and in many cases, because they stop bad things from happening. None of these are work programs. They exist to solve problems like
Mhm.
natural disasters. And we may have a very grim summer of civic education this year as natural disasters out across the United States. FEMA is not ready for this. As someone who used to do research on disaster response, FEMA is not ready for what is coming. That's very plain now. The previous acting head of FEMA was fired when someone in Congress asked him if it was a good idea to get rid of the agency, and he said, it's not a good idea. It's not good for the public. Um, and so we may be experiencing a very costly lesson about what it is that government does that we normally don't need to pay attention to until it's ripped out.
Well, I can't thank you enough for being here, Don. Once again, if you've not read his piece about what you can do to stop the civil service from being politicized, it just takes a couple minutes of your time to weigh in. Please do. You've got until Friday to make your voice heard. And it's just so nice to talk with someone who can break down a lot of really complex things when it comes to government. And again, if you have not subscribed to uh, Can We Still Govern, which is done Substack, please do. And if you want to stick around with us on Lincoln Square in about 20 minutes, we have Anchor Watch with Bobby Jones, and he has a lot to talk about in the run up to Memorial Day. So I hope you'll stay with us on Lincoln Square. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us on this Tuesday morning.
Thank you so much, everyone.